Good afternoon, everybody. We're about to have a great intellectual treat, and one which I think is absolutely consonant with our program here at Van Leer about economics and society, because we are interested in the point of view of economists on larger than purely theoretical questions, on questions that relate specifically to non-economic value in our larger society, and what is the interaction between economic and non-economic concepts of value. And I think this talk does it. Now, Sam Bowles, you can all look him up in the internet, but he's worked a great deal on inequality, on cooperation, on altruism, on all kinds of themes that speak to what we should do. Now, I want to say a word about that. When I grew up, when you all grew up, we thought of economics as the paradigmatic reductive discipline. You know, there's one or two factors, land, labor, capital, you can reduce everything to that. And we also thought that the Marxist anti-capitalist view was also very reductive, because it was even more reductive. It believed in a labor theory of values, so that was even worse in a way. One of the things we've discovered in every field that I can think of, whether it's biology and the levels of selection debate, is the importance of anti-reductive kinds of reasoning, of seeing different kinds of causalities at different levels. And I think it's important, if we are to engage in radical critique of our society, that we cease being reductivist and that we start thinking rigorously about different levels of critique. And it is in that spirit that I feel it's a great privilege for us to welcome Sam Bowles. So thank you.
Well, it's a great pleasure for me to be here as well, and I want to thank you for inviting me to the Institute, and I want to thank all of you for your interest in my work and for coming here. I teach at the University of Siena now, and so I present for you a beautiful fresco which is on the town hall, the wall of the town hall of the town of Siena. And what you have here is a picture of good government. It was, as you can see, the date is 14th century date. Is this on? No. It's a 14th century picture. And it's quite remarkable because the entire fresco, from which this is a very small detail, is entirely secular. It's just a picture of how a society might be if it were governed by good principles. And at about the same time, the elite of Siena, actually it was quite a large number of people, gathered and wrote a constitution in which they were convinced that the town should be governed by men who love peace and justice. Now that may sound obvious to you, but it was not obvious to others a bit later. But let me start with, first I should start with my co-authors. I am happy to have a very large team of co-authors working both at University of Siena and at the Santa Fe Institute. Sandra Polonia, as you can see, is a community activist. She's also a very successful experimental economist, something that some of you probably have never even heard of. We do experiments with people. I'll tell you about them. Wang is a mathematician. And here are some of the papers that I'm using that we've jointly authored. Let me begin with somebody who agreed with the fathers of Siena that morality was essential to good government. Here you have Aristotle famously proclaiming, "Lawgivers make citizens good by inculcating habits in them." And this is the aim of every lawgiver. If he does not succeed in doing that, his legislation is a failure. It is in this that a good constitution differs from a bad one. Now, this idea, of course, seemed, as I say, obvious to the people who founded Siena and to Aristotle, but it was not obvious to economists and philosophers who followed them. The most famous was, of course, Machiavelli. Machiavelli said in the Discourses that all men are wicked. Hunger and poverty make them industrious, and laws make them good. He did not think that laws made them actually be good, but he thought that laws might make them act as if they were good. Now, there was then a large series of people, another Italian, of course, Thomas Hobbes, Mandeville and Hume and Smith and Bentham, who you will be hearing about a bit more. This whole tradition had the idea of essentially setting aside the Aristotelian concern with morality in favor of good laws. good laws will substitute for good citizens. The most interesting of these guys was a Dutch doctor named Mandeville. He lived in London, and he certainly was an eccentric guy. He wrote a very famous book called The Fable of the Bees. It was written as a poem, and it was written about insects so as to avoid the scandal which a text about human beings would have caused, because what he said was that bad motives may lead to good consequences. Here is some of his prose. Thus, he's describing the colony of bees, the hive. Thus every part was full of vice, yet the whole mass a paradise. Such were the blessings of that state, their crimes conspired to make them great. The worst of all the multitude did something for the common good. Separating consequences from motives, a major theme in economics. And a subtitle of one of his editions was, Human frailties may be turned to the advantage of civil society and made to supply the place of morals. Made to supply the place of morals. It was a key phrase here, and that's exactly what the project of economics soon became. This is a little bit like one of those Walt Disney pictures of a flower opening up, and it does it in the matter of a few seconds, because I'll have to jump ahead now, an entire century. And who was it who finally made good this promise of this fantasy about the bees? Of course, it was Adam Smith. Adam Smith said, it is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. So Smith and the classical economist perfected this idea that there could be a kind of invisible hand which would guide selfish individuals to implement allocations and to implement outcomes in an economy which would be desirable from some standpoint. This was the so-called invisible hand. Now, the invisible hand was, in Smith, a claim, a speculation, and it took a century and a half, actually a bit more, before Kenneth Arrow and others actually proved an invisible hand theorem. But yes, indeed, that is what they did. There are conditions under which this self-interest model works. I'll come back to that shortly. Hume and Bentham, both also philosophers, although Hume was a very prominent economist as well, contributed to this reversal of the Aristotelian idea. Hume was writing a bit before Adam Smith, and he said, political writers have established it as a maxim that in contriving any system of government, every man ought to be supposed to be a knave, and to have no other end in all of his actions than his private interest. By this interest we must govern him, and by means of it make him, notwithstanding his insatiable avarice and ambition, cooperate to the public good. Now, of course, Adam Smith did then propose how that might be done. Bentham, whose text from 1789 would be called probably today a text in public economics or in public finance, he was concerned with how should we design governmental systems and systems of incentives so that selfish individuals would implement the public good. And his way of putting this was rather fancy. He called it the duty and interest junction principle. He wanted to design salary and compensation schemes to make it each man's interest to pursue that conduct which it is his duty to observe. Now notice, none of these people were concerned about persuading the public servants to be good or persuading the citizens to be civic-minded. Rather, they were trying to find ways of converting self-interest into good outcomes. Now, this is a spectacular idea. It's one of the most radical ideas that any social science has ever invented. Because the idea here is, I'm sure you all remember what the medieval alchemist did. The medieval alchemist converted ordinary dirt into gold. And this is exactly what they're proposing, that we're going to find a way to transform base motives, ordinary selfish motives. We're going to transform those somehow into outcomes which everybody was happy with and which result in a well-governed economy. This has been celebrated in many, many ways. The most charming, I think, describes how a Nobel Prize winner buys his fruit on his way home from the office. This is James Buchanan. I don't know the fruit salesman personally. I have no particular interest in his well-being. He reciprocates this attitude. I don't know, and have no need to know, whether he's in the direst of poverty, extremely wealthy, or somewhere in between. Yet the two of us are able to transact exchanges efficiently because both parties agree on the property rights relevant to them. That's crucial. because both parties agree on the property rights relevant to them. So there's no question that this is an apple, and if the guy gives me a bag and says there's apples in it, and it turns out there's not, well, I can get my money back. So that means we agree on the property rights. Now, but what if we don't agree on the property rights? There are lots of interactions in a modern economy in which the property rights are actually not very well defined at all, or if they are well defined, they can't be enforced. If I borrow money and promise to repay and sign the contract, and I have no money at the end of the day, I can't repay. If I'm a worker and I go to work and promise to work hard, that's not a promise that can be enforced because of the sheer difficulty of observing, much less bringing to court, the observation that I was asleep under the table. Now, it's because of these parts of the economy in which we don't agree about the property rights that are relevant that we have to continue to be concerned with morality or preferences other than the selfish ones. I mentioned the example of work and credit. Information is another one, obviously. It's very difficult to enforce and probably not even a good idea to enforce intellectual property rights. Now, in all of these cases, what economists now call other regarding preferences like altruism, honesty, truth-telling, work ethic, all of these things, these are extraordinarily important in making possible exchanges between people when the exchange itself isn't fully specified in a contract. Here's what Arrow said about this. This is writing in 1972. In the absence of trust, opportunities for mutually beneficial cooperation would have to be foregone. Norms of social behavior, including ethical and moral codes, may be reactions of society to compensate for market failures. Market failures, of course, being exactly those cases in which we don't have complete contracts. That's a picture of Ken Arrow. He's a dear friend of not only me, but Eitan Shishinsky and probably 10 other people in this room. Frequently visits Israel. Now, the good news, I mean, if Arrow is right, that we really do need some kind of ethical foundation for economic exchange, then we have to regard it as good news that we found out from the last decade or decade and a half of behavioral economics that there is a lot of altruism out there. In experiments around the world, literally in dozens and dozens of different cultures, I'll tell you about some of them in a while, we find out that in games which replicate things like exchanges or contributing to a public project and so on, things in which trust is involved, people are actually quite altruistic, quite trusting. They reciprocate trust, they reciprocate kindness. Just to give you a rough idea, if you look across all of these experiments and all of the kinds of subject pools that we have studied, certainly those who are consistently selfish, the way the economic model specifies, are a minority, and in many cases quite a small minority. I mean perhaps a quarter or a third. Other people may be unconditionally altruistic. Other people may be conditionally altruistic. I treat you well if you treat me well, and so on. Now, that doesn't end the story, however, because the good news that people are not entirely selfish isn't sufficient to vindicate the standard model in economics. And to do this, I have to turn to a little bit of fine print, and I hope you'll excuse me. It's called the separability assumption. I hope you're impressed with that term from mathematics. It's quite a simple idea, and it's surprising that people didn't actually interrogate the problem of separability much earlier. The classical writers knew that people had morals. Adam Smith, of course, wrote a book called The Moral Sentiments, and Hume is famous for his theory of the evolution of moral reasoning. They didn't think that people were amoral, but they did assume that what Smith called the moral sentiments and the material interest could be pursued independently. That is, we could design policies to shape behavior according to the latter, according to the material interests, without compromising the former, without compromising ethical orientations. That's what I mean by separable. That is, that these two things can be taken as if they're additive. We, of course, have some moral commitments that may induce us to contribute to the public good. And if we have some incentives, well, all the better, if we're going to get rich by doing so. Now, these propositions, what I call the separability idea here, or additivity if you want, have formed the basis, implicit always, of modern economic theories, of what's called mechanism design. That's designing incentives to induce people with their private motives to act in some larger interest. What is called welfare economics, optimal deterrence, including in judicial reasoning, sentencing policies, how to keep kids from dropping out of school, and so on. This has been the basic idea. It's false. In this particular paper here, I surveyed 41 experiments, some of them done by me and most of them done by others, in which and I'll give you some examples, in which the two are not additive at all. Now, the happy news is that some of them are super additive. That is, the presence of an incentive actually stimulates the moral sentiments. But those are about 6 out of the 41. And the others all go the other way. Now, I say this is the last year's Nobel Prize winners, Maskin, Meyerson, and Hurwitz. These are the guys who really promoted mechanism design, and they've done a tremendous service to economics and to human society by figuring out clever ways to give the invisible hand a helping hand. But they have not questioned the separability assumption, and so I've proposed to them, I know them, that the next step in mechanism design should be to take seriously where we go if it turns out that we have problems of non-separability. Let me give you an example. This is from a recent paper, as yet unpublished, but it will be published, by 2 economists. This here measures the amount of investment that an individual will contribute to the public good. So individuals are asked, how much do you want to give to some public project? They're going to benefit from the project, but not nearly as much as their contribution. If they contribute $1, they'll get some share of that, 1 over n. So they'll probably get 20 cents or 10 cents or something of that nature. This is how much they contributed. So, for example, a public goods experiment could be like voluntarily paying taxes or participating in a demonstration or something in which there's a common benefit in which you could just as well say, well, I hope you do it, but I'm staying home. Now, in this particular experiment, the benefit that you get from the experiment itself would induce you to contribute 25. What people actually contributed when there was no incentive was 37. Well, then they tried something interesting. They said, well, let's try some extra incentives. We're going to pay the people who contribute more. We're going to actually let them have a special share of it. So here we have, if we have some low bonus, well, with the low bonus, the selfish person would contribute 30. But the individuals in the experiment actually contributed 38. The high bonus really worked. If you give people a high bonus, well, then they should have contributed 50 if they're selfish, but they contribute a little more. Now, what do you think about the experiment? It's a little complicated, isn't it? Because when they started out with no special incentive, they were contributing 12 more than self-interest would dictate. But when they had this high incentive here, they contributed virtually no more than self-interest would dictate. So there's something going on here whereby we have the idea that there was a motive here to contribute when there was no special incentive that was diminished. Well, it's complicated because obviously there's a lot going on. If I just showed you the dots, the solid dots, you could conclude, as many economists have, that incentives work. After all, it's upward sloping. Not very much at first, but you might say incentives work. I'm going to convince you this shows you that incentives don't work, and that incentives crowd out morality. And to do this, I want to distinguish between 2 types of crowding out. Suppose this is the amount that you would contribute under no special incentives. That's the amount that you would contribute if there was an incentive of a very small amount, let's say 1 penny, epsilon. Suppose they say, we're going to give an incentive, but it's really, really small. Now, there are a number of things that can happen. What's called separability here is, well, if you contribute this much when there are no special incentives, then you should contribute a larger amount if the incentive's higher. I'll show you some experiments in which this is how much they contribute without incentives, but they contribute less the higher the incentive is. That's what's called strong crowding out. But notice this line here is also crowding out, because this one here says if it's separable, the slope is as given there. The fact that this is a much lower slope says somehow the incentive is being dampened by that is, the incentive is eliminating some of those moral preferences. Well, I can translate this into the previous experiment. This distance here, well, first we look here. In this case, they contributed 42, but, sorry, they contributed 38. They should have contributed 30 if they'd been selfish. So that's quite a bit of ethical orientation. Out here, they contribute barely more. But the interesting thing is here, if you had a little incentive, sort of vanishingly small, as an epsilon incentive, that's how much they would have contributed. And so there's an amount of crowding out of moral behavior that doesn't depend on how big the incentive is. It just depends on if there is an incentive. I mean, intuitively, I'm sure you can understand that. Suppose you're going to give to charity and there's no incentive. Then somebody tells you, oh, well, actually, you're going to get a tax break. And suppose you find out the tax break is really minuscule. Wouldn't it kind of change the meaning of this thing that you're giving, even though with a tax break, even though it was small? I mean, for example, your neighbors wouldn't know that it was small, and maybe you would even perhaps be a little bit confused about what this is. You want to signal to yourself that you're a generous person, but you're doing something. To what extent is the tax break important? Now, there are a whole bunch of puzzles. As I was preparing this lecture, I decided to present to you the evidence that this kind of crowding out actually occurs. And I just realized that that's not news anymore. Everybody knows that. Since the time I published the science paper, I've now discovered 10 more experiments. A couple of them, and most of them are new, but a couple of them are ones that I had overlooked. So it's not controversial that crowding out happens. It is puzzling why it happens, and if we understand why it happens, how we can design better policies to take account of the fact that people have both moral and selfish motives, and we'd like to get them working together rather than working at cross purposes. So here are some of the puzzles. I don't promise you that I'll answer the puzzles. In fact, I can tell you right now that my strategy in lecturing is always to say what I think we'd like to know, and then tell you as much as I can tell you about what we'd like to know, and admit that the second isn't adequate to the first. But that's because this is a wonderful time to do economics, to do economic research. There are a lot of people here who will find ways of answering these questions much better than I can. Now, the first thing we know is very interesting. Very often, when you design an incentive, people respond to it exactly as they should if they're selfish. Exactly. And, and this, of course, makes economists very happy. They say, here's the incentive, here's the response. This proves that our models are right and that people are selfish. But, however, if you then give them the same problem without the incentive, they don't respond as they're predicted to respond in the absence of the incentive. They often contribute more, as you saw in the case of the study which I just gave you. Even more puzzling. Sometimes if there's some incentives in place, and they have some effect or other, then you take the incentives away. It turns out that people behave differently after the incentive is gone. Even having ever experienced incentives has a lasting effect, almost always negative, by the way, on how people contribute to public goods. Another puzzle. When you have what's called this public goods problem, very often we designed experiments that are kind of fun to do. You have a group of people, say 10, and you ask people to contribute some amount to the public good. Then typically they'll contribute some amount. Over time it tends to decline because people get angry at the other people who aren't contributing. And if you understand the way the game works, the only way that you can get back at them is by not contributing yourself. So, if you're not going to the demonstration, neither will I. So that's what happens. Now change the game just a little bit. At the end of these are all done on computers. At the end of each period, on the screen it says, here are the amounts contributed by the other people in your group. Of course, not by name. We don't want to have any violence breaking out. So A contributed this and so on. And then on the screen it says, would you like to spend some of your payoff to reduce the payoff of anybody else? We never use the word punish, but that's what it is, essentially. We allow the members of the group to impose a fine on the other members at a cost to themselves. Well, okay, everybody think hard about this. The contribution to the experiment, the contribution to punishing is a public good, just as contributing to the thing in the first place. So, as I said, the contributions fall off if you don't have punishment. What do you think is going to happen when you allow punishment? Something very surprising. People punish like crazy in the beginning, the first few rounds, and after about 5 or 6 rounds, there's very little punishment happening, and a lot of people are contributing, and it's sustained over a long period of time. Well, that's interesting, because notice here, there are fines being imposed, but we're getting a positive response. That's not what you would expect from the crowding out idea. Take exactly the same problem, and suppose that I'm it's called a trust game. Sometimes the name is given that I'm an investor. Suppose I'm interacting with Eitan, and I have $10 or $100, and I can assign as much to him as I want. The experimenter then triples the amount that he has, and then he can send it back to me as much as he would like. And that's the end of the game. I have no way of forcing him to send any back. Okay, ask an economist, how much should I send? What's the answer? 0. Because if I believe I'm selfish, I believe he's selfish, well, I just do what's called backward induction in game theory, and I can tell that because he's selfish, he won't send any back no matter how much I give, so I'll give him nothing. And that's the so-called equilibrium of that game, 0-0. That's not at all what happens. What happens is people contribute various amounts, and they're reciprocated. If I contribute a lot, Eitan will feel either obligated to or a certain pleasure in reciprocating. That's a puzzling fact, isn't it? I'll show you some experiments which do exactly that. Because in one case, well, let me wait till we get to the experiment, because there's a nice puzzle here that and this one I think I know the answer to. No, this is non-repeated. Obviously, when you repeat games, you can have some really interesting results. Almost none of some of these are repeated, but in the case of the repeated games, all the ones that I present are what's called the total stranger treatment. Well, that sounds really science fiction. It's the following. We're in a public goods game, and there are 10 of us together. The first round happens. Maybe there's punishment, maybe not. The second round, I'm with an entirely new group of people. That's called the perfect stranger treatment. That'll become important in a second. Now, one of the things we notice, here's another puzzle, is that these incentives that sometimes reduce the total amount of the pie are widely used in society. Why is that? They're obviously counterproductive. We'd like an answer to that. And finally, we'd like to know, in the presence of this, what are optimal incentives? And on this, I'm happy to say there are a number of great contributions by Israeli economists to this particular problem, one of whom is here, Chaim Firstman, and others, I don't know. Finally, I want to turn to the question about this. If it's true that a decent society requires people to have ethical values, and if it's true that market incentives drive out ethical values, what are we to say about the long-run stability of liberal market societies? Is it possible that liberal market societies is a parasite on tradition, relying for its sustenance on morals and ethical orientations that come from religion and the family, things outside the liberal orientation that liberalism does not seek to perpetuate and some people think actually may undermine? So these are the kind of questions I'm going to try to address. Okay, the first one was, why do we sometimes observe that the incentives are exactly responded to as an economist would say? Well, here we have the incentive says this is a public goods game. They should be contributing that much. There's a set of incentives which make it optimal for the selfish individual to contribute 30. And sure enough, over these rounds of the game up until 20, they contribute 30. Then at 30, you take off the incentive. Without the incentive, they should be contributing, I guess that's 7. But they don't contribute 7. They contribute a lot more than 7. It declines eventually to 7, but it takes a very long time. So, in other words, in this case, the individuals acted entirely selfishly. They didn't go beyond the incentives at all. Here, with no incentives, they decided to go beyond what would be selfish. Somehow the incentive was triggering a kind of, it's okay to just be selfish response. But more interesting is this. Here we have a situation where they have no incentives to begin with. They've never experienced the incentives. And here, once again, you can see they contribute a bit more here, and then it declines. What I want you to notice is that the contributions here are much less than here. In other words, the experience of the incentives has made them contribute less. Now, here we add the incentives back in, and sure enough, they go right back to doing the selfish thing. So there's some kind of learning going on here, some kind of perpetuation, some kind of, you pick up some idea about the nature of the game, or you acquire some kind of new ideas about what you ought to do. I should have perhaps given you this information while I was telling you about the game. This is an experiment that I really love. It's partly because it's done by a student of mine. It's done in Colombia, the country, and it's done with people who live in rural areas. These are not done with students. And they are people who access the forest, and in one case water resources, for their livelihood. And they're overexploiting the forest. So what the guy did is he played a public goods game with them. He said, he was actually a kind of a community organizer guy, and he wanted to go in there. And his first idea in playing the games was he wanted to use the games as a way of entering the community and talking about cooperation so they could save the environment or do better for the environment. He later found out that when his paper got published, he became famous as an economist, so now he's just being an economist. Let's look here. I'll draw your attention to the top graph first. This vertical dimension here is how much they deviated from the selfish behavior. If they deviated 6, these are called months of extracting. If they deviated 6, that was the social optimum. They should all, harvest 6 months less from the forest than the selfish amount. So a 0 deviation here means they're perfectly selfish. And as you can see, these are two different groups, the reds and the blues. They're about halfway in between. So they weren't being optimal, but they weren't being selfish either. Now, here, they stop the game and they say, okay, we're going to change the rules now. With the red group, we're going to let you talk to each other, which typically they did in the first round. You can talk for 5 minutes, and then after that, you play the game. And as you can see, that helped a little bit. These red guys did better. That's a little higher than that. But for the, I guess it's blue or black group, they said, we're going to monitor your behavior. If you take out more than the social optimum, we're going to fine you. And so initially, the guys who were subject to the fines, they did exactly right. They deviated a lot from the selfish behavior. But over time, it declined so that by the end of the game, they were acting entirely selfishly. Now, of course, the fact that they were being fined and monitored meant that selfish behavior induced them to be a bit more cooperative. But what I want you to see from this top graph here is that the fine itself extinguished some kind of moral motivation, because here they're acting almost entirely selfishly, but before they experienced the fine, they were deviating quite a bit from what would be the selfish response. This is the trust game that I mentioned about my interaction with Szyszyński. Focused at first on the gray bars. The gray bars tell you, if I send him 2, he'll send me back 4. Remember, it gets tripled, so he's doing okay. If I send him 8, he sends me back a large amount. Now, change the game a little bit, and let me say, okay, Eitan, I'm going to send you 4, but if you send me back less than 10, I'm going to fine you. Well, that's the black bars. So notice, by adding a fine, you actually degrade the behavior. And you degrade the behavior in the precise sense that this amount of reciprocity here is now considerably less. So apparently the fine the fact that I threaten Szyszynski with a fine means that he thinks, well, why should I give it to him? He's not trusting me. I shouldn't be nice to him. What does that tell you? Well, it tells you that somehow the fine is a piece of information that Eitan looks at me and says, oh, I could have fined him, but I'm not. I must be a nice guy. Or I must trust him. I must expect something good from him. Now let me come to the one of the puzzles. Here we have a public goods game. This is with, I said, with punishment. Sure enough, that's the social optimum. They should be contributing 20. They contribute about 12, and it doesn't decline. That's because they all have the opportunities to punish each other, and they work it out. Here's what happens when you take away the punishment. It goes down to 0. It works exactly the same way if you reverse the order. We always reverse the order in these experiments because we're concerned about what are called order effects. Of course, the puzzle is this. Here we have this case here in which my proposed fine had a negative impact. Here, the fines are having a positive impact. So now we have a slightly harder problem. Apparently, it's not the fines per se that's the problem. It's the information which they convey. So here, remember the perfect stranger treatment. If we have a public goods game, and I observe that you've contributed little, you A, you person C, or whatever you are, I take $3 out of my pocket to punish you $3, and then I know you're going to be in another group next period. How do you interpret that? Well, it can't be a greedy action on my part, because suppose my behavior modification attempt works. That'll help other people. It won't help me. There's no way to interpret punishing as anything other than altruistic. So when you're punished by a person who's not going to benefit from it, you probably feel shame, guilt, something of the kind. You certainly don't feel anger that I'm exploiting you. That's not the case here. If I'm trying to get Eitan to return a lot more, it's because I want a lot more and I want him to have less. Now, that's what I suspected in this experiment, so I did the obvious, which is people varied in how much they asked to return. So in some cases, people would tell the other person, here's 10, and then the amount that they required to be sent back would, if it was sent, exactly divide the pot equally. So I'm saying, I'm going to be generous, send me back this amount, and that'll be 50-50 on the pie. In that case, there was no negative response. The negative response happened with the people who said, here's 10, and by the way, I'm going to get everything back from you, otherwise I fine you. In other words, the response was not to fining. It was to greed, or the appearance of greed, or the signal that you were trying to take advantage of the other person. Okay, so as I said, I don't understand. I'm absolutely certain that these things happen in the world. I don't really know why they happen. I'm proposing for you some speculative arguments. What I think the fine does often is it's a frame in Daniel Kahneman's and Tversky's sense. It tells you what kind of situation this is. You know, people are very much dedicated to finding out appropriate behaviors. Incentives explain to us what kind of game it is. That's partly what they do. Incentives also change how people think. They change change people's desires. They change our attitudes towards our fellow person, whether we're competitive towards them or whether we see them as in a solidaristic manner. They give information about the intent of the other guy. It's unfortunate for an employer or for a banker, it's an unfortunate fact of life that in designing an incentive about you, I think those of you who study economics know how this goes. I assume that I know something about you. I know how you're going to respond to incentives, and then I impose an incentive on you to maximize profits. Well, guess what? By imposing the incentive, I have revealed what I think about you. So suppose I say, I'm going to pay you a lot, and I'm going to monitor you very carefully. Well, you could infer from that you think I'm lazy, that's why you're monitoring me, and you're paying me a lot because the job is really horrible. Or any of the other things I mentioned about intent. And finally, the question about why these perverse incentives, counterproductive incentives, are so common, I think you probably intuited the answer to that. The fact that the pie is smaller doesn't mean that the share of the pie going to the employer or the banker is smaller. In many of these experiments, the employers and the bankers are getting a larger amount, a larger slice of a smaller pie. So essentially, incentives are pretty good at redistributing income. They're just not very good at creating income in some circumstances when they have these negative impacts on what are called social preferences. The reason why you see this beautiful picture by de Latour is because I don't have much to say about this particular problem, which is I don't know what the mechanisms are. I would really appreciate your help. I think the crucial thing that we should be thinking about is this. Economists talk about producing, investing, exchanging. What are we talking about? We're talking about getting things. But we are also engaged in being someone, becoming someone. So there's an acquisitive aspect and a constitutive aspect of action. And what economists have missed when they make this assumption about separability is that the constitutive aspect of our behavior may be very important. And sometimes incentives that appeal to the acquisitive part may work at cross purposes with our project of self-constitution to be a good person or to signal to others that we are such a person. I'm going to go over this, the question of optimal incentives because I want to get to this maybe provocative idea that I proposed to you that maybe a liberal society is living on borrowed time. Don't worry. Many philosophers mostly, but others too, have observed that our societies depend on a substrate of virtue, to use an old-fashioned expression, that's rooted in non-liberal institutions such as family and religion, that is pre-liberal. From different points of the political compass, this view has been endorsed, saying that essentially the core institutions, especially markets, will jeopardize the kinds of morals on which a decent society depends, including the functioning of markets themselves, according to Kenneth Arrow, but also living in decent neighborhoods, living in security, and the like. Well, Edmund Burke, the great royalist, was here writing about an insult to the Queen, actually was writing about the past insult to the Queen, which had gone unavenged by the aristocracy, and he complained that the age of chivalry is gone, that of sophisters, economists, and calculators has succeeded. Nothing is left which engages the affection on the part of the Commonwealth so as to create in us love, veneration, admiration, and attachment. Or, from the middle of the political continuum, Alexis de Tocqueville, whose famous book Democracy in America is a masterwork in political philosophy. It's also the trendiest, it makes Lonely Planet look really shabby because it's essentially a tour guide to America written in 1830. But it's a very, very erudite book. Writing about the Americans and of modernism and markets in America and commercialism, each person is a stranger to the fate of all the rest. His children and his private friends constitute to him the whole of mankind. As for the rest of his fellow citizens, he is close to them, but he sees them not. He touches them, but he feels them not. He exists but in himself and for himself alone. And, of course, if those two agree, you can predict that we'll get agreement also from Marx and Engels, who famously wrote in the Communist Manifesto, the bourgeoisie has put to end all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations and left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest. Fortunately, they're wrong. It didn't happen then. It's not happening now, as far as I can tell. It is remarkable how much a very essential part of late 18th century and early 19th century ideology or ideas, I mean, these are actually very great thinkers, all four of them. Okay, let me tell you a story that I did. I did experiments around the world. The relevance of this is we want to know whether or not being associated with the market is kind of bad for morality. The places that are not Chicago or Zurich, maybe I should say no, we have some here in Mongolia. The places here plus Mongolia are places where we did experiments with hunters and gatherers, with herders and primitive agriculturalists, for example, Amazonian groups using slash and burn agriculture. And we played a series of games with them. The one that we played most often was the so-called ultimatum game. It's very simple. The experimenter gives me some sum of money. In some cases, they'd never heard of money, so we couldn't do that, but we gave them something valuable. And then I am then asked to give part of that, including 0, to another person who is unknown to me anonymously. That is, I give it to somebody else. So suppose I have 10 little packets of tobacco. We once used tobacco in one of these. And I assign one tobacco packet to the other guy, and I keep 9. The other person then has a single decision to make before the game is over. Take it or leave it. If they take it, they get 1 tobacco packet. If they leave it, they get 0. And so do I get 0, right? So it's a really clever game. Because notice, by not accepting the 1 packet, I get to punish that unjust character who divided the 10 9 to 1. In other words, I have the opportunity in this game to act on justice, but at a cost to myself. That's so here we have a measure of how much people gave in the game. These are normalized, by the way. So these are in standard deviation units. And here we have a measure of how market integrated they are. I'd be happy to explain how we measured that. It was somewhat complicated. But we have some groups here, like this group in Africa. These do a lot of buying and selling of stuff. These people here, the Hadza, are in Tanzania. They have no market engagement at all. I actually hunted with them a year and a half ago, and I can tell you that this is a group that really is really at the boundary of the known populations of the world. So you're figuring out the graph, and I see some of you are not looking happy with it. What it says is that the more market integrated the society is, the more they contribute in the game. It's also true that the more market integrated the society is, the more likely they are to refuse a bad offer. What's that about? No, they're not actually. It's not that they're rich. These are really poor societies, most of them. Okay, a little bit of paleoanthropology. The societies we're talking about, many of them, particularly the hunters and gatherers, the anthropologists who actually did the experiments in these societies, in some cases, they knew every single member of that population. That is, they knew personally every person who speaks Aceh. So it's a very small community. If you see somebody who's not Aceh, that means danger. There are hostile relations between adjacent groups. People come and take stuff. They kidnap people and so on. So people who have, I think the existence of our hunter-gatherer ancestors was probably pretty conflictual between groups, and certainly the evidence from current groups and recent groups testifies to that. Well, what do markets do? Markets teach you that you can benefit by interacting with strangers. You can benefit through essentially trading, obeying some kind of rules, and essentially reciprocating exchanges with goods of equal value and so on. Now, I don't know if this is the reason why the more market-oriented societies were more generous and also more justice-minded, but it does suggest that it may be that markets are actually a way of teaching people about how to deal with strangers. And by the way, if you want to know what ethics is about, it's not dealing with people in your family. It's dealing with people who you've never met before. That's the real challenge in ethics. Now, so I don't know what the answer is here. I have to say that seeing I was the author of this study, it was with some embarrassment that I opened the Wall Street Journal just after we published this and found, what does the guy say? The civilizing effect of the market. Now, I have written extensively on the way in which markets undermine cultures, undermine decent cultures. So the fact that I found, and by the way, none of that was ever published on the first page of the Wall Street Journal. Some of it had a hard time even getting published in, arcane economics reviews. But as soon as I published something that said in this particular experiment, markets are okay, they really liked it. Many people thought that markets would make people selfish or immoral. That view is at least too simple, if not just plain wrong. I was at the time living in Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is in one of the western time zones. I got to my office pretty early, about 7 in the morning that day, and already the telephone was ringing of my friends, my leftist and anthropological friends on the East Coast, saying, "What the hell are you doing?" But as I say, science is a wonderful thing. You find out stuff you didn't expect to find out. So essentially, the explanation I'm offering here is one that Voltaire thought of a long time ago. Enter the Exchange of London, that place more respectable than any court. You will see there agents from all nations assembled for the utility of mankind. I'm not entirely certain of that, but let's continue. There the Jew, the Mohammedan, the Christian deal with one another as if they're of the same religion and give the name infidel only to those who go bankrupt. So there may be something to this markets, not as homogenizing, but as giving us a kind of way of treating people who are quite distant from us. Now, I want to continue with this idea of parasite on tradition. This is what you will recognize. This is a public goods game. They start off contributing around, between 8 and 14, and they decline over time. Now, notice all the countries in which this has been done. This is from a recent paper in Science. And the pattern is very similar. They're all, this is basically replicating what we know about public goods games. Of course, you can stare at this graph for a long time. There's some really interesting things that, here, Copenhagen, well, no surprise there. And, down here you have Istanbul. And, you think about, what you know about cooperative cultures. But if you study this carefully, I doubt very much that you'll find much support for the idea that liberal market society is less cooperative than illiberal or pre-liberal market societies. I wouldn't want to make the case that the opposite was true, but I certainly wouldn't want to try to make the parasite on tradition argument here. If you add punishment, you sustain cooperation, but at very different levels. But what's interesting is punishment works in every society. It's really remarkable that the people who did this experiment took a huge risk, just like we did with our experiments in 15 small-scale societies. You have no idea how it's going to work out. But, there's a very, very clear pattern here that the punishment activity is working. The problem is this. In most of these countries, they would be better off without the punishment option. That is, they'd be better off just having the cooperation declining. And why is that? Well, because punishment is expensive. People spend a lot of time essentially trying to hurt each other in these games. Here's a beautiful example of this. This is the net gains. Above 1 means you're gaining compared to when punishment was not allowed. Well, notice, at the beginning, nobody is benefiting because they're all punishing each other so much to try to get cooperation going. But after about, 4 or 5, there's a whole bunch of countries, and they're doing pretty well. You'll see here at the end a bunch of people stop contributing, but that's just because some of them have studied game theory, and they know that everybody should defect on the last round of the game. Fortunately, not everybody has figured that out. But what I want you to notice here is that a lot of these countries, it's actually a majority, they never benefit. They never get to a situation in which they're benefiting from the cooperation, from the punishment. Why is that? Well, it's because they have they have punishment arms races. And there's a remarkable fact here. Look at, this is almost an unbelievable chart. This says that here you have people punishing those who contributed less than them. Well, that makes a lot of sense. It happens in Melbourne, Nottingham, Boston, and so on. So these are all people who are punishing the free riders. Down here you have people who are punishing the people who contribute a lot. So, look at Muscat, for example. There's more punishment being given to people who gave the same as you and people who gave more than you than there is to the people who gave less. So, what goes on here? Well, suppose I'm playing this game and somebody punishes me. Well, I probably figure out that that's one of the Mother Teresa types, who's giving a lot. So I go after them and I punish the people who are giving a lot because they're the ones who are punishing me. So you have a vendetta. That's what it's called, a vendetta. Where do vendettas happen? They happen in what anthropologists call segmentary societies or lineage-based societies. Lineage-based societies are characterized by the fact that primarily order is sustained within family-based groups, lineages. If I think that if somebody in that lineage over there has maybe stolen my bicycle or harassed my daughter, I don't go to that person. I go to the head of the lineage and I say, listen, you've got to discipline that person in your lineage because he's acting out. And typically it's done. That is, that's how these things are resolved. You don't simply take off and try to punish somebody. If you do, you get the whole lineage against your lineage. And you have these famous vendettas. Well, what is the liberal state? The liberal state in Europe, it took about 300 years to manage to get a monopoly on the use of violence in settling disputes. I mean, in France, for example, it had a famous battle with the aristocracy because the aristocracy wanted to have duels. That's the way they settled things. And the state said, no, we're going to be the one who actually administers justice. I think that was a fantastic contribution. It allows a society to develop ways in which you don't respond in this arms race vendetta-like way. Now, like the rest of this lecture, I'm not convinced that liberal market society is good for values. I'm just, I would say, if I had to write a paper on this tomorrow, which I'm glad I don't, I guess I would say that the idea that it's a parasite on tradition is unsupported by these data. Do I worry about the effects of these incentives on values? Yes, of course I worry. And I worry in part because if Machiavelli's ideas and Mandeville's and Smith's and Hume's and so on, if they were a mistake for the 18th and 19th and 20th century, they are a disastrous, maybe fatal mistake for the 21st century. The idea that we can let prices do the work of morals, if it was ever wrong, it's wrong today. Here we have a picture of the internet, and I put that there deliberately. In the past, we were a world connected by sinews of trade in grain and steel. And that was the main connections across the globe. But now we're connected by disease transmission, information, climatic effects, political violence. That is, the things which connect us today throughout the entire world are no longer exchanges governed by the complete contracts that Kenneth Arrow wrote about. They are things in which we affect each other by sneezing, by driving our car, by creating information, stealing somebody else's song to put on our iPod, and so on. It's a different world. It's called the weightless economy. Remember where you heard that word first, the weightless economy. It's an economy you can't hold in your hand. You can't write contracts in it. That's what really matters in the world today. Most of it is services, and as you probably know, services are the vast majority of economies today. And the direction we're going is, I mean, forget about smokestacks. That's where we're headed. And restaurants and people giving services and so on. So perfecting incentives based on self-interest, using private property rights, competition, and so on, in a world of incomplete contracts and necessarily limited government capacities will fail if it compromises moral sentiments. We need the moral sentiments to deal with these problems here. We're not going to solve those problems in their absence. And so there's, of course, a lot of truth to what Smith said. Well-defined property rights, competition, proper taxation, subsidies, and so on may still help self-interest to put the bread and the meat on the table. But it's not going to secure a sustainable and secure future for us in the presence of the 21st century economy, that is the weightless economy. Thank you very much.
You talked about two different kinds of goodness and two different aspects of goodness in different parts of your talk. In the first part, you talked about goodness and how incentives or punishments manipulate goodness. And then in the second part of your talk, you talked about the kindness of strangers, or the goodness that exists between people who don't know each other. And you talked about that as a basic kind of morality. Now, I was thinking about I thought the first part of the talk was super pessimistic, and I'll say why. Because I thought that every case that you said about the goodness in the first part of your talk was that the effect could be explained that any information at all is going to cause you to be less altruistic. So if you're acting in a situation where there are no incentives, no punishments, no information that you're getting, you're going to be better. And the minute you get any information, it's going to get worse. So what does that do in the Internet world? The more information you have, the less good you're going to be, according to that model.
I think I understand the question. I understand why you're asking it. I am, by the way, not super pessimistic. First, a small addition. Remember, in the public goods game, when you get punished by a peer, that's a piece of information. That's the people in the group don't like you. They don't like what you did, and we see a big positive response to that. So it's not that more information induces self-interest. It's the kinds of information, like requiring a fine, and so in my principal agent problem. That's really the crucial thing. Now, more information, I mean, one of the reasons why I'm so optimistic is precisely because of the ability to have information over a global scale. And seeing that you mentioned the Internet, think about how open source software is produced. It's produced by some very complicated way of people. It has nothing to do with private property rights. It can't. It does have to do with reputations. It has to do with people working cooperatively. It has to do with a sense of craft, very much like the way we work. And those are situations in which you have monitoring on a global scale. I don't know if you participate in these groups, but when somebody fixes a bug, if it's a real fix as opposed to a fraud, everybody knows about it within a few minutes. If somebody fixes something and it turns out not to be a fix, there's lots of jokes that go around. And this is exactly, by the way hunter-gatherers do. If people brag, they're finished. So I think we have opportunities today for this horizontal monitoring, not hierarchical, that are really, really effective. And I think we see it in some of our communities today, including, surprisingly, some of the academic communities. So, as I say, I'm not particularly pessimistic. Are you going to tell me how much money you'll give back?
Let me say some. Take, for example, prenuptial agreements. You know, here, for example, this is obviously one where I think Becker has said that the existence of a prenuptial agreement already provides changes the relation, the type of the relation. So it would call for perhaps imposing prenuptial agreements, because then you will not get any information. If the law will say everybody needs a prenuptial agreement, then there will be no information about your spouse, that she or he required that, which already says that he or she is thinking about deviations and some other possibilities, and that will not change. So there's an increasing role, it seems, from this for compulsory kind of arrangements that will not provide information. That's one remark. I think that's is called for. The other is more fundamental. I'm worried.
Sorry, Tom, when you say an increasing role, you mean there should be an increasing role?
There should be an increasing role.
You don't disagree with this?
No, I don't disagree.
I don't either.
No, I'm saying they should. I'm saying if it would be imposed somehow by a benevolent society somehow, then that would not provide information. Will undermine this kind of information, negative information about your spouse. The other thing is I'm worried about everything we had about welfare economics is sort of gone, given your non-separability. Sort of, I'm saying, what is desirable? In other words, if markets and actions change also sentiment, morality, and so forth, how can we rank situations?
Okay, let me first talk about the question about prenuptials. Yes, I agree with that. I think there's a very wide range for this kind of thing. In every case, I think it should be the default option, out of which one can opt if they want. There's a very interesting new book by Sunstein and Thaler called Nudge, or Nudge. A nudge is another thing. Yeah. Somebody asked me how to pronounce nudge, and I couldn't remember the difference, but I know one is a Yiddish word and one is an English word. Improper upbringing. I would have known, if I'd been brought up in a different family. But in any case, that's really the whole theme of the book, is that in many cases, by imposing a default option, you can have much better consequences. But I don't think they make this much better argument, which I'm going to take over and use. You think you've lost something, but maybe you didn't have it. This is a serious problem, which is the simplicity of economics and our ability to say something simple and often correct about matters of taxation, subsidies, and so on, did rely on the separability assumption. Now, I think it's absolutely important to try to identify where this thing happens and where it doesn't, because we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. The standard structure of public economics is a very valuable set of ideas. Right now, we don't really know enough. But as I say, if the experiments are coming at the rate of 10 every 4 months, I mean, we're going to know a lot more 10 years from now. And I think we will then be able to demarcate the areas of economics which are basically relatively immune from this, and those areas which are not. I can pass up the...
Two observations. The first one is you're saying that free market economics is crowding out moral sentiment and values and so on. But the question is, what is the alternative to free market economics?
I didn't say free market economics. I said markets.
Markets. Well, and the question is, what is the alternative to markets? I mean, if the alternative is primitive societies, then maybe it's okay. But if the alternative is state intervention and I'd say controlled markets, then you have to test what is the impact of this on crowding out moral sentiment and values and so on.
This isn't, my contribution is not about the left and the right. It's about how incentives work and how they may not work. A socialist economy will have to use incentives too. They'll probably be fairly similar to the kinds of incentives that are used in a capitalist society. One might hope that a different kind of society and a different kind of incentives would inspire, make more salient, mobilize the moral sentiments, or perhaps that it would allow people who have those sentiments to have a larger share of influencing the outcome, as in the public goods game, where a few civic-minded people can actually get the selfish people to act like they're cooperative, as opposed to the opposite, in which you have no punishment in the game and a few selfish people can get everybody acting selfish. But I can't imagine a society working without incentives, and I can't imagine a society which won't have to face the problem of separability. I think the only hope is, I mean, I have identified a couple of situations in which inequalities between principles and agents may be part of the problem. Now, if that's real, if that is sustained as a research finding, then I think there is a real implication about inequality, in which a cooperative group of workers, say, working as a team, as mutual owners of the net output of the team, they might have opportunities for imposing incentives which wouldn't have this problem about the greed factor. They might have other problems, but I think that's the way we should think about that.
The second thing I want to ask you, some of your puzzles that you presented, maybe they can be solved by generalizing a little bit the concept of a utility function. I mean, we think about utility function of consisting of a vector of tomatoes, apples, children, leisure, and so on. Maybe you should add one more component to this vector, which is a sense of justice.
I think many people here will thank me for not including that in this paper, but if you look in the recent publication of the Journal of Public Economics, you'll see I do exactly that in a paper I'm working on actually today, is precisely to try to figure out what is a mathematical representation in which our utility depends on apples and oranges as well as our ethical contributions, and the way in which those may be crowded in or out. As you can probably understand, whether you know mathematics or not, this is a hard problem, because if I'm choosing apples and oranges, I just have to know how much I evaluate apples and oranges. If I'm choosing how much I want to contribute to your welfare, well, that will depend on how much you contributed to my welfare in the past, if I'm a reciprocally minded person. And therefore, if we both start out acting selfish, I may want to continue acting selfish. If for some reason we both start out giving each other little birthday presents, maybe we're going to end up, in a love fest. And you see the problem. We can have a multiplicity of equilibria in this problem, in which you may have a set of good citizens all surviving because of their past experiences with each other have been good. But that doesn't mean these people are any different from the people who live in these horrible societies in which social capital doesn't exist. It may mean simply they just had different histories. Now, that's a hard problem analytically, and it's a hard problem also to think about how you transform a society from one in which there is distrust to one in which there is trust, because it involves, the problem which was popularized by Thomas Schelling about driving on the right or driving on the left. Suppose we didn't have a state. And suppose we, for some reason, thought that driving on the right was better than driving on the left. and we wanted to switch the side of the road, but we couldn't have a government to do it. How would you go about doing that? Would you try a little bit, you know, and you wouldn't do so well.
The trucks first.
Yeah, that's...
So first buses.
Yeah, that's right. No, first the military vehicles, then, yeah, that's right. No, but we're already introducing the state. But, I mean...
That is how the left and right changed in Europe. Napoleon decided that he was going to switch sides so that his forces would come across the other side, coming up unawares, and would be able to attack them quicker.
But it's... Yeah. Well, if Napoleon was involved, probably the state was involved. All right. Other? Yeah. Sorry, I didn't see your hand. Oh, good.
If I donate a certain amount, I feel well because I'm generous. If I get something back, this is my generosity is questioned. So it is a negative effect. It is, and it should be a negative effect. I mean, the assumption that it is a positive effect, I think, is not true. Number one.
Yeah.
Number two, that's about Eros theorems. They are all static. There is no theorem saying how you go to the equilibrium. And what happened now in the current crash is really the dynamical effect and not the static effect. And on that, unfortunately, the theory of economics has nothing to say.
Well, nothing is a bit strong, but I think the situation is in a sense worse than what you say. It's not that there are no theorems about how you get from some point to the equilibrium. The theorems that exist say that you can't, in general, say anything about that at all. So it's even stronger that, yes, Sonnenschein 73. Debris also. These are very strong results. That is, the dynamics of the general equilibrium system pioneered by Debris and Arrow are almost entirely without information. That is, it can go any way you want. So essentially what we've done in economics is we've identified the existence of some equilibria that have good properties. We haven't explained how you would get there, and we haven't explained how if you were there, you would remain there. Now, that's a serious problem if you're in a situation in which, as you say, we have a dynamical problem. Now, all of the work that I do is dynamical. That is, I'm interested in the perpetuation of a particular kind of society, the perpetuation of preferences. So, for example, when you ask me about incentives, how I answer it is the following. You design an incentive so that after the incentive's effect on the preferences has taken place, the resulting equilibrium is one which you like. That's a dynamic problem because you have the learning process going on as a result of the incentives. And if you want to complete the story, suppose you're a government. Then you have to also have an incentive which, once imposed, will perpetuate the electoral majority which led you to get elected in the first place to do this job. Now, this may sound like a complicated problem, but by the way, it's things that politicians think about all the time. That is, you introduce some, I mean, imagine in the United States, we introduced affirmative action. Affirmative action was motivated by vast feelings of the injustice to which African American people had been treated. But affirmative action itself then became a lightning rod for the kinds of procedural injustices that were associated with affirmative action itself. That's an example of an intervention motivated by a set of anti-racist preferences that didn't succeed in reproducing the preferences upon which it was based. I think you're absolutely right. Whether we're talking about financial crisis, whether we're talking about long-term economic policies, we have to think dynamically. Now, I'm not very happy with the fact that economics has made so little progress with dynamics. I myself, I work with dynamical systems, and I work a lot with computer simulations, that is agent-based simulations, because I think they're pretty good at getting some guesses about how a system might work. But they're nothing like theorems, but the theorems are, I think, going to be unforthcoming. Yeah, Chaim.
Almost all your examples, you use the word incentives, but you might as well you had some kind of characterization of some generalization even of Lucas' critique, because you have some policies, and policies, when you design a policy, you know, it's just not just you need to take into account the optimal behavior of people and the reaction of this policy, but policies, general policies, change people. This is, you know, behind your argument. Like incentive change the preferences, policies change people. So if you think about it in much more general way, so it's not just a picture of incentive. The picture is much broader. You're talking about public policy that need to take into account that you indeed change the vector of preferences in the population. So the criticism is much larger in this sense. No?
On this matter, you should read a beautiful paper by Chaim Firstman and
no, this is not what I meant.
Bargil. In which he does exactly that, and also his comment now helps me understand an email which he sent me late last night or yesterday.
True, but
this is true. In which he said something about the Lucas critique. It was very cryptic, and I was pretty tired, so I didn't really understand what he said. Now I understand exactly. Yes, that is exactly the right way to see. Yes, by incentives you could substitute public policy if you want, but I'm talking about private incentives as well. Of course, I mean, it's a kind of psychological variant of the Lucas critique, because the Lucas critique is based on beliefs rather than on preferences. Eitan, again. Yeah.
Can't stop you without giving an example. In Israel, the kibbutz started without any incentives at all. You know, to anyone according to his ability, to anyone according to his needs. And that's when I grew up, and now they privatize, they provide incentives, and it poisoned relations. These are, you know, in many cases it really poisoned relations between people, the incentives in that community of select and idealistic people.
I think we can see the same thing in the very first experiment that I gave you, when they didn't have any incentives. I think people gave more than the selfish amount because they had a sense of solidarity with the others. Once they were competing with each other to get the prize, then they saw each other as competitors. And that's why they began to give very close to what the selfish amount was.
I can't imagine that you think there were no incentives living a perfect life. People who formed kibbutzim thought they were going to be in utopia. What could be a better incentive?
I think what Eitan meant by incentives was material incentives.
Indeed. That's what happened to me.
The examples you gave had to do with simple transactions in the games, the ultimatum games. But other relations in society, which are very important, they're difficult to conceive, except in moral terms. A relation, of course, between a teacher and a student, or between a doctor and a patient, or between a soldier and his commanding officer, or between a parent and a child. These are all relations that you can't think of except in moral terms.
That's correct, and I think that adds a great deal of strength to my last slide, which says, right now, we're moving into an economy in which virtually all the important relations have the character of the ones that you said, in which these are not simple relationships that can be subjected to contracts. The fact that I showed these effects in simple games, which are like buying an apple or something of the kind, and the effects worked there, a fortiori they're going to work in the cases that you mentioned, and a fortiori they're going to work in the management of intellectual property and the kinds of things I mentioned, like the production of great software, the production of great music, and the sharing of it on a world scale, and so on. So those things, I mean, if what I'm saying is true about the ultimatum game and the public goods game, I think we are in deep trouble in the weightless economy unless we change our reliance on selfish incentives.